Evening, everyone.
Evening.
How are you this evening?
Great.
That's good. Anyone know what this is? Remember those? Anyone know what it means?
1990s.
1990s? Yeah?
What was John doing?
What would Jesus do? WWJD. What would Jesus do? Anyone ever have one of those bracelets? WWJD? Yep. Cool. So they stood for what would Jesus do, and you're supposed to wear them to remind yourself of what Jesus might do if he was in the same situation that you've suddenly found yourself in. Of course, the problem... What? Sorry?
He wouldn't touch bees.
He wouldn't touch bees. Well, Shane, I'm sorry to say that at least 2 people in this congregation have texted me this week to tell me that they've touched a bee, so... Anyway, maybe he wouldn't, maybe he would, I don't know. I don't know whether Jesus would touch a bee or not. That's the problem, isn't it? Like, it's hard to know. Would he touch a bee? Would he not touch a bee? And that's the problem with the whole what would Jesus do? It's sometimes it's difficult to figure out. I remember when the Prius first came out. I mean, that kind of dates me too, I guess. But, you know, the Prius first came out and there were all these WWJD memes going around. What would Jesus drive? And the Prius people, the Prius fans, were insisting that Jesus would drive a Prius because it was like an environmentally friendly vehicle, right? And that made a lot of sense. But then these other memes started to surface, suggesting that, well, actually, wouldn't Jesus be driving a Hummer? Because, I mean, he's driving around the desert in Palestine with 12 of his mates. Like, what else is he going to drive? Anyway, I was thinking about what would Jesus do, and I am reasonably confident of what Jesus would do if he were at MCC tonight. He would go to GYG after the service. He would. He would. I'm like 95% sure about this. Not sure about the, I don't know, multinational companies, but whatever. He would be at GYG. He would also go, I think, to Hendrika and Michelle's other monthly night out where, you know, they choose a local restaurant and a bunch of people go there. Now, the Wednesday Northerners group. Are there people here from the Wednesday Northerners group? Yes, there's a couple. You guys go out to dinner once a month, don't you? Is that right? Did you go out this week? Was it last week? Yeah? Where'd you go? Cactus Jacks. Cactus Jacks. I think if Jesus had arrived last week, he would have been at Cactus Jacks on Wednesday. He would have. And are there people here from the New Farm group? They meet on a Wednesday here. Your New Farm group? Yeah, all the New Farm group people. Did you go out this week, or is there something coming up?
I think it was about 2-3 weeks ago.
Okay. So you folk go out about once a month or once every 6 weeks or something?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. There's a lot of people going out for meals. Jesus would have been there. He would have. Why am I so sure about this? Because in Luke's Gospel, when the people who don't like Jesus come up with the worst insult that they can think of, they call Jesus a glutton and a drunk. That's the worst they can come up with when they're insulting Jesus. And one commentator on the Gospel of Luke said famously, in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is either on his way to a meal, at a meal, or on his way home from a meal. And it's true, you read through Luke, and sometimes there's the same story in Matthew or Mark, but when you read it in Luke, you find out, oh, that happened at a meal. So, you know, literary types talk a lot about recurring themes or motifs, technical terms, and maybe in a story that you read, like a novel, there might be a theme of revenge, or a theme of forgiveness, or a marriage theme, or a sexuality theme. Well, in Luke, there's this motif of food. There is food. There's food all the way through Luke. It just runs from start to finish in the Gospel of Luke. There is food. And food isn't just food, is it? Like, a meal is not just a meal. When you guys go out for a meal with your small group, yes, it's about the food, but it's about a whole lot more than that. And when you invite friends over for a meal, it's an occasion, isn't it? It's a chance to catch up, to laugh together, to cement your friendship. And think about the important occasions in our lives. There's food at weddings. There's food at funerals. There's food at Christmas and at Easter. Most celebrations involve food. And we all know that it's not actually about the food, but it's sort of like food is at the centre, and there are all these things that circle around food. Things like friendship, celebration, sharing of sorrow and of joy. There's an acceptance that comes with eating together. There's a welcome. There's a bonding. At the heart of the occasions where we share food, where we sit at a table with someone else, at the heart of that, there's an acceptance of the person that we're eating with. It's a welcome of that person, an offer of hospitality to that person. So the fact that Jesus is constantly at meals, eating with people, that says something about Jesus' welcome of people. It says something about Jesus' acceptance of people. And when I read through Luke, and there are all these stories about meals, it's like they're just dripping with significance. And even more so when we think about that first century context that this story is set in. Because inviting people to dinner was a very complicated business in the first century. It had the potential to either increase your kind of social value and your honour in the eyes of your peers, in the eyes of other people, or decreasing it. So it was kind of like there was this unwritten social brownie point system, if you like. If you invited people to your home who were more important than you, higher than you on the social pecking order, and they accepted, you're going to look great. Like, that's going to increase your honour in the eyes of everybody else. And what's more, if they accepted your invitation, then they're sort of obligated to invite you back sometime. And sure, we've got a little bit of that in our culture, right? Like, I invite you to your place. At some point, somewhere down the track, maybe you'll invite me. But this is sort of much more transactional than that. Like, you have to do it. If you've been invited to someone else's place and you have gone and eaten their food, then you absolutely have to invite them back. It would be a massive social faux pas if you didn't. And so if you invite somebody over and they're more important than you, then they're obligated to invite you back, and now you're going to be mixing with people who are, you know, in that upper echelon. It's going to make you look good for you to get that too. That is so much more than in our culture where, you know, you can meet anybody at McCafe, right? It's not quite the same. Of course, you had to be an excellent host. If you invite people to dinner, you've got to be an excellent host. If the dinner burnt, if the jokes fall flat, you're in trouble. Everybody has to have a good time or you are going to look bad. So, a lot of pressure. You have to get the seating plan right. The most honoured guest sits closest to the host in their estimation. Who is the most important out of all the people I'm inviting? They will sit next to me, and the further away you are, the lesser of importance you are, the sort of lower down the social ladder you are. And if you get the seating plan wrong, you could find yourself with offended guests who might not invite you back. This is a thing. To be seen eating with someone of lesser importance is going to decrease your honour, so you do not want to do that. So you have to be very careful about the invitations you accept and the people that you invite, because it's going to be a social nightmare for you if you get it wrong. So keep all of that in mind as we think about the meal scenes, if you like, in Luke. So I'm going to sort of take a foodie tour through Luke. Think about what happens at the very beginning of Luke. We've got Jesus as a newborn. Where does he get placed? In a manger. You know what a manger is? It's a feed box. Jesus gets placed in a manger in Luke. Levi, this tax collector that we heard about tonight, hosts a meal for Jesus and his friends. And because Jesus accepts the invitation, he looks bad, because nobody hangs with tax collectors unless you're one of those sort of people as well. So he looks bad. But you know what? He doesn't care. He's very happy to be partying with them. And he defends himself against the important Pharisees who criticise him for doing such a foolish thing as to eat with a dishonourable bunch of people. We move on. We got this guy called Simon the Pharisee. He hosts a meal. He invites Jesus because Jesus is a fairly important rabbi. A very upset woman who has a reputation. She shows up in the dining area where they're eating. And this woman is crying so much that Jesus' feet ended up being drenched in her tears. She can't stop kissing his feet. It's a bizarre situation. Can you imagine being there? Simon's horrified that Jesus would let that sort of woman, it says, touch his feet. But Jesus points out, well, you know, Simon, when I arrived, you didn't even give me any water at all to wash my feet. And you didn't welcome me with a kiss. She just keeps kissing my feet. You invited me to dinner and you turned out to be a terrible host. But this woman is a much better host than you are. Did a much better job of hosting Jesus. Jesus hosts a banquet himself. 5,000 plus people show up for this banquet. And do you know what? He doesn't agonise over the guest list. He doesn't think about seating plans. He doesn't even send out invitations. He just feeds anyone who shows up. Can you imagine? He proves that he is an excellent host because he provides so much food they can't even eat it all. There are so many leftovers gathered up. And he did all of that with a couple of fish and a few loaves of bread. Jesus gets invited to dinner by another Pharisee. And Jesus actually turns out to be a terrible, terrible guest. He picks a fight with his host. You don't do that. He says terribly insulting things to his host. He breaks all the rules about being a good guest. And it's a huge black mark against his name, and I bet he never got invited back to that place. At that banquet, just to rub salt into the wound, I think, he tells a story about this very wealthy man who sent out invitations to a banquet, and lots of people RSVP'd with a yes. You know, they're on the right page. They want to be in with this guy. But then when the time came, they insulted their host by not showing up. They had better things to do. Maybe they thought they were more important than him after all. Well, his response was to send his servants out to fill up the seats of his table with people who don't regularly get invited to banquets, which in the first century were the poor, the blind, the beggars, people who couldn't possibly return his hospitality, people who would not make him look good. But he doesn't care, this wealthy man, because he just wants his house filled with people who can celebrate with him. Another story Jesus tells is about two sons and a father. One son is very responsible and always does the right thing. The other one is a wayward son who breaks his father's heart by leaving home and squandering his father's money. Once he's broke, he comes home hoping to be accepted, not as a son by his father, because he's blowing that, but as an unskilled labourer. The father's response, let's kill the fatted calf and throw a party for this young son. So he welcomed the son back with open arms. The responsible son thinks this is terribly unfair. I guess we can understand that. And he refuses to come to that party to celebrate. I've been good all these years. I've been slaving away for you, and now you go and welcome this brat of a son of yours. I'm not celebrating his return. And that too breaks the father's heart, and he pleads for the other son to come in and join the feast, the banquet, the party. We don't know what happens. A rich man who is also a tax collector. He's rich, but he's this dishonourable kind of misfit tax collector that nobody likes. He's despised by his whole small town. And for some reason, he's desperate, just desperate to see Jesus when he hears that Jesus is passing through town one day. He just wants a glimpse. And so he climbs a tree so he can get a good view over the heads of all the other people. He just wants a glimpse. But Jesus stops at the bottom of the tree. And Jesus invites himself to dinner at Zacchaeus' house. He expects Zacchaeus to just quickly prepare a banquet for him, and not only that, but give him a bed for the night. He invites himself to dinner. The rest of the townspeople, they're horrified that Jesus would associate with this man, let alone want him to stay at his house. But you know, Zacchaeus, he's over the moon. He almost trips over himself trying to get to Jesus and welcome him and have Jesus come and stay. And do you know, having Jesus come over for dinner turns Zacchaeus' life around. Just coming over for dinner. Jesus hosts a meal for his disciples. He provides for them again. But this time the food and the drink that he offers them is his own body and blood. As their host, he lays down his life for them. Even the guest who was at the table who betrayed him. Two disciples, they're walking along on a road to Emmaus. They're devastated by Jesus' death. And they meet him face to face after the resurrection, but they don't recognise him. They don't know who it is. But even though they don't recognise him, they offer to host this stranger for the night, and he accepts their offer. But the tables are turned when Jesus takes on the role of host. They invited him, they're the hosts, but when he accepts the invitation, he turns out to be the host. He is the one who takes the bread and blesses it and breaks it and hands it to them. And that's the thing that opens their eyes and they recognise him. They recognise him when he breaks the bread. It's all about food. The last thing that happens in the Gospel of Luke is that the risen Jesus appears amongst all of his disciples. Well, they are just terrified. They think he's a ghost. And because they're so stunned, they just forget all their manners. They don't even think to offer him food. They're terrible hosts. Have they learnt nothing? And Jesus has to ask for something to eat. And they give him some fish, and he eats it in front of them. You know, they're just the big stories in Luke, the ones that really jump out at you. So many stories about food. And there are so many more. In every single chapter, there's stuff about food. There's parables about wine and wineskins. There's references to fishing. There's disciples walking through fields of grain and eating grain. What is this all about? Why is Luke so obsessed with food? Well, I don't think it's so much about the food as what I was talking about before. It's hospitality. It's about welcome. I love the way that Luke presents the way of the Mandalore. Or wait, the way of Jesus. I mean Jesus. How Luke presents the way of Jesus. Because the way of Jesus is hospitality. That is what the Christian faith is. If you had to define the Christian faith, if Luke had to define the Christian faith, I reckon he'd say, well, it's Jesus inviting us to dinner. It's Jesus welcoming us. It's Jesus extending an invitation on God's behalf to come to dinner, to sit and eat and talk and laugh and share our sorrows and our joys. And Jesus is a wonderful host. He provides for everyone. There is a place for every single one of us at his table. The Lord of heaven and earth wants you to come to dinner and bring a +1 with you. Luke makes it very clear that it's up to us whether we accept his kind invitation or not. Some decide to refuse. Jesus knows that. Doesn't stop him extending the invitation though. In Luke's gospel, Jesus stands holding this invitation out to anyone who would take it. Some of the meal stories, they're kind of left unfinished, like that classic one about the parable with the 2 sons. As a very carefully structured literary story, the ending is missing. It's like you sort of get to the final bit and you're expecting, and the older son came in and they all lived happily ever after. But that's not how it ends. Instead, the older son is left out in the field, and we really want to know, did he come in or not? But we're not told. We're just left hanging. The story's left open-ended. The invitation just sits there. Will you come in and celebrate the return of your brother? Or will you stay out in the field? Are you going to come in, celebrate what God's doing? Are you happy about God welcoming those wayward children? Or are you going to gripe and grumble about what God is doing and how unfair it all is? In Luke, Jesus is not always the host. Sometimes he's the guest. And sometimes he's a pretty pushy guest, bordering on rude. I must stay at your house today. Oh, right, okay. I don't know what I've got in the fridge. I've just run out of strawberry jam. Get some milk on the way home. Are we going to welcome him or not? He wants to come and stay at our place today. Putting your faith in Jesus means welcoming him, opening the door, being pleased to see him, eager for him to come in and eat with us, even if we haven't tidied up the house and the bathroom's in a mess. And that mutual welcome, it changes us, just like it changed Zacchaeus. It changes the way we look at things, the way we look at ourselves, the way we look at the world, the way we look at other people. Because Luke's emphasis on food is also about welcoming the people that Jesus welcomed. It's not an optional extra. It's a crucial part of Luke's gospel. Following Jesus means not only welcoming Jesus, but welcoming the ones that he welcomes. In Luke's mind, in his gospel, these are two sides of the same coin. It's not possible to welcome Jesus if you're not going to welcome the people that Jesus welcomes. It's the same gospel, and those things can't be separated. If you want Jesus to come to dinner, well, you might have to bring the bunch of sinners that he brings with him. It might affect your reputation to be seen hanging out with them. And if we accept his invitation to a banquet, we might find ourselves sitting next to some really odd people. So I reckon we'll fit in, won't we? Finally, many of Luke's stories about food point forward to the day at the end of this era, whenever that is. In Luke, and all the way through the Old Testament, all the way through the New Testament, there's this end. And it's pictured as a great feast. People are going to stream to this feast from the ends of the earth. The ones who accept God's invitation to dinner, who've welcomed Jesus, who've enjoyed his hospitality, who've brought the +1 with them as he breaks the bread and blesses it. Jesus invites you to this table that he provided, his own life given for us, the bread and the cup that he gave thanks for and passed around to his disciples.